As part of Health by Design's ongoing commitment to behavioral health education, we present another lesson in our Fundamentals of Weight Management series. Here's the Medical Director of Health by Design, Dr. David Player.
Hello again. I hope you heard enough about record keeping last week. You're going to be tired of hearing about this as we go on, but as I said before, record keeping is, I think, one of our most powerful tools that we can use, those of us who have relatively low metabolic rates. And I want to spend a little bit of time today reviewing just the general concept of record keeping, and then head off into one component of record keeping, of course, which is the understanding of energy expenditure. Now, we said last week that all of us basically are in a balanced state when we come in here, where energy output and energy intake are more or less the same. Maybe for a long period of time energy intake has exceeded output, and that energy output is made up of three things: our resting metabolic rate, which is kind of your motor running all day long. It's something that goes on whether you're sleeping or awake. It's like a motor idling. And it accounts for about 70% of all the calories you and I will expend in a day. So it's very important. The second is something we call the thermic effect of activity, which is everything you and I do from the moment we get out of bed in the morning. It would be things like twitching or jumping around or moving or talking, or just the things I'm doing right now are expending some energy calories. So that's the thermic effect of activity. And it's about 20% in general of all the calories we burn. The third thing is known as the thermic effect of food or digestion, and that says that when you and I eat a food, it costs us something. There is a cost of living, if you will, for digesting things. So that's about 10% of all that we burn in a day. So that's our 100%. You know, there just ain't any more. 100% of all the things we burn. And of course, energy intake is all the foods and things that we eat. And most of us, when we cut back on our calories, when we change, most of us simply do a diet by messing around here with EI. We try to take this down and think that that's going to solve our problem. And I'll try to convince you today that that clearly isn't the way to solve the problem, because for most of us, the major problem comes here in our resting metabolic rate. As I said, our real dilemma here is that the people who come to Health by Design, if I can redraw this curve, are people who, in general, women who burn about 8 times their body weight per day, and men who burn about 10 times their body weight per day when they walk in the door. And these are middle-aged people I'm talking about. Younger people used to do a little better than this. But they're clearly people who are way over here with a relatively low metabolic consumption, because they go to schools and churches with people who often, women who burn 12 times their body weight, men who may burn 14 times their body weight, and there may be even some people who are way over here burning 14 and 16 times their body weight. Clearly the field is not very level. There also are some people who are way over here who burn no more than 6 and 8 times their body weight, or even lower. These people, of course, tend to be fat. And as I said, the society changed. The genetic pool didn't really change that much. I suspect that these people 100 years ago were really not very fat. When we think of what society has done in the last 100 years in the name of progress, we no longer walk to the outhouse 7 or 8 times a day. We no longer chop wood. We no longer take ice to the ice box. We no longer shovel coal into a furnace. We no longer plow corn behind a mule. 1,000 things that man doesn't do now that he used to do 100 years ago. And so those of us who are in that same genetic pool, as I said last week, have become increasingly fat with time. And these folks over here don't have to be very smart about all these things we're talking about, but those of us who are here, as I said, have to know a lot of medicine. We have to be pretty educated about our bodies. We have to understand these components of EO and these components of EI, almost as if we had a disease, if you will. We have a kind of physiologic or biochemical condition that makes us vulnerable to being fat. These people are vulnerable to being fat, and to the extent that we accept our physiology and our biochemistry, we have a shot at it. Now, if you think how a guy spends his day, I thought when I was considering this activity stuff not too long ago, how it is that mankind has gotten into such trouble with body fat, because remember, we're about a pound a year fatter than we were 20 years ago, men and women, in this culture. And if that's true, we have a major epidemic problem going on, and we ought to be getting better at it, but we're not, and most of it is because we haven't accepted this. And we didn't understand how people spend their time. I looked at my time expenditure. I spend somewhere between 8 and 10 hours a day sitting at a desk talking to people about medicine, about the kinds of stuff we're doing right now. 8 to 10 hours there, and then I spend another 6 to 8 hours sleeping, and that leaves me, what, another 6 to 10 hours a day to do all the other stuff that I've got to do in life. And of course for me that includes honeydews at home, it includes taking care of children, it includes doing math problems with kids at 10 o'clock at night, it includes walking the dog, it includes a whole variety of things, some of which are active and some of which of course are very sedentary. And I think what you see there is because the culture changed so much, because my job isn't farming anymore. My job is not scooping grain in a grain elevator or loading boxcars or some of the things that I did as a boy. Because it is not, I am extremely vulnerable to being fat, and in fact I have been fat and understand that very well. Now if that's true, and I tell you that I don't think anybody for his whole life is going to keep cutting back on EI over here, on changing food intake all the time, because remember we have a dilemma for nutrition to get all of our protein and our vitamins and our minerals in a day and still cover EO, in other words, still have energy expenditure be greater than EI, is a real dilemma. We have people who actually cannot get all of their protein, vitamins, and minerals in calories few enough that they really lose any substantial amounts of weight. So as you look at this equation, you finally say, well, if I can't fix this, i.e. right now there's no magic pill or magic button that I can push to raise my resting rate, and I'll talk about that in a little bit because there are some things that we can do to raise resting metabolic rate. But if I can't fix that very much, what can I fix here? Well, I can fix my TEF, my thermic effect of digestion, by eating high protein diets, and basically that's what you're doing with your diet supplements right now. You are eating a relatively high protein diet as a function of your calories. In terms of total grams of protein, of course, you're not on a very high protein intake. That leaves us really just one thing here that we can fix, and that's this thermic effect of activity. And the thermic effect of activity means all the things that you and I do from the time we get out of bed in the morning until the time we go back to bed at night. Okay, now there are 3 very important things that have been learned about activity, and I want to kind of put them up here. Some of them we will have talked about before. The first one is, I'll change ink here. The first one that we've talked about is that whenever we decrease carbohydrates in diet, we increase our requirements for protein. And all of us have now, or most all of us, have collected a 24-hour urine for urea, and we have seen, in fact, that our urine urea excretion is a certain level, and that means we must eat a certain amount of protein per day to keep even with our urinary urea excretion. So that's the first thing we learned, is every time you're on a diet for the rest of your life, you need to, as you decrease carbohydrates and fat, you need to increase protein. You don't do that, you will be in danger of losing your lean mass. And losing lean mass, as I'll show in a minute, is a big problem. Now the second thing that's been learned about diets is as we decrease EI, as we bring our food intake down, the resting metabolic rate here, which is already not very good in us, takes a hit and goes down maybe 10 or 15%. So with decrease, let's put it decreased carbohydrates again in a diet, the resting metabolic rate drops unless we increase activity. It's been well shown, and you'll get the papers later on in this course to show you that individuals who go on diets and lower their carbohydrates and their fats in their diet will not lose lean mass if they increase physical activity while they are cutting back on their carbohydrates. And that's very, very important, that they will not lose lean mass and they will not decrease their resting metabolic rate. And that's the third thing then that I was going to say, is that if you decrease carbohydrates, your lean mass will decrease if or unless we increase activity. So people who are going to be on low-calorie diets for a period of time and plan to lose body fat, according to this equation, must understand that there are two major reasons why you would not want to have an increased activity program. One of them is you don't want this resting metabolic rate, your 8 or 10 times your body weight, to go down. The second one is that you don't want to lose your lean mass, which is a major component in causing our resting metabolic rate to rise. So having seen that, it's apparent that nobody should go on a diet who doesn't plan to increase his physical activity somewhat. And we've heard you need to do more exercise, need to eat less food, but really it goes, if I plan to eat less food, I really need to increase my activity, because if you don't increase your activity, you will both lose lean mass and you will secondarily and primarily lose resting metabolic rate. And the last thing you want to do is to get on a diet and see that you don't lose any body fat because your resting metabolic rate, which was already bad, went down some more. Okay, now what can we do? What kinds of things can we do then that constitutes increased activity? Well, I'd like to say that everything you and I do is increased activity, but remember, when you came here, you already did some activity. For heaven's sakes, many of you were already doing quite a lot of activity. And so when you got here, you had increased body fat in spite of doing whatever it is you do in the day. So remember, when we keep our records up here, I say that resting metabolic rate plus thermic effect of activity plus thermic effect of digestion all together last week constituted some factor times our weight. Factor times weight. So for women, it's around 8 times body weight. For men, it's around 10 times body weight for people who typically come to Health by Design in middle age having more body fat than they'd like. That was with your normal activity level. Now, as I said last week, if you add some kind of activity to it, however, that you've never done before or that you wouldn't do routinely, that can't be included in this factor times weight that includes your regular activity. And for those who've done record keeping over the years, the easiest way to do this is not to every day, just because you went out and chopped wood someday, to change your factor times weight just because you did more in here. The easiest way is to learn the calorie expenditures associated with activity and add it to your factor times weight. So on your records, on the sheets that we gave you last week and the ones you have before you, you should have something at the end that says, I burned factor times weight plus something that I'll call extra exercise calories. And for the rest of this hour, I'm going to be talking about ways that you and I can get extra exercise calories. Now, it's important, first of all, to remember that foods are measured in calories, or the energy associated with food is measured in calories, and the energy associated with activity is also measured in calories. So in a way, you could say that eating an apple has so many calories, and walking a mile has so many calories. And in fact, as you see on the sheet before you that has all those different activities listed, almost every kind of activity has a number of calories per minute or calories per mile or calories per hour or something like that for activities that have been measured in different sizes of human beings. And I think the important thing here for you to remember is that every kind of activity has a certain calorie expenditure. Now, what should we do? Well, if you had to consider activity for this sake, and weren't talking about what makes people live longer or what's aerobic and things that we'll talk about in a while, the most important things for you who are on diets, of course, is to not lose lean mass and not lose resting metabolic rate and to expend more energy than you did before. In other words, increasing this from 20% to maybe 23% of everything you spend in a day. If you could do that, that'd be wonderful. And if you think of the things that would be important for exercise for a person who's been too fat, I think you should think that whatever you do should be daily. It should become sort of routine. As I tell people at my desk how wonderful it would be if I could ask you and I'd say, well, Luann, how did you spend your day? And you would say, well, I got out of bed in the morning and I went to the John and I walked 2 miles and I came back and bathed and I brushed my teeth and I went to work, or I put on my makeup and I went to work. In other words, the activity just kind of flowed out with everything else. You did 2 miles of walking, and that was just what you did. You kind of did it because it was a part of your life. And that's how I'd like all of you to talk, that you had some kind of activity that was a part of your life every day. So it has to be kind of daily and routine if it's going to be used as a fat-losing technique or a weight maintenance technique forever. It's not something where you say, well, I play golf once a week. Playing golf once a week may be a tremendous expenditure of energy, but it isn't very routine. It isn't a part of your daily life that you do every day to maintain a certain size body. The second thing is that whatever exercise you pick cannot injure you. It has to, if it's going to be done daily for the rest of your life, it can't be something that hurts you. How often I've had guys who love to play basketball or love to play racquetball or tennis. I love all of those things. And when I think about it, the last time I played racquetball, I dived for a shot into the corner, I dove for a shot, and I busted my knee up, and I felt terrible. And for about 2 weeks after that, I couldn't do my daily routine, which was walking. So whatever that doesn't mean I don't think you should play games, of course, but it means that if you pick an activity that's a life activity, you want it to be one that you could do every day if you could, and you would not want it to be something that routinely hurt you. It was the reason I originally stopped running, because finally with my running I was hurting my knees and my ankles and my low back, and I'll talk about that more in a little while. The third thing here is that whatever activity you pick cannot be too hard or yucky. You and I are not chronically going to do something that's yucky or too hard day after day and after day of our lives. It just seems doubtful to me that a guy is going to go climb a mountain every day of his life. A guy is not going to ride 50 miles on his bike every day of his life. Those are things that are just too tough. So you will have to pick an activity that cannot be too difficult. And finally, it would be wonderful if we could pick an activity that burns lots of calories. Wouldn't it be wonderful if one could sit in a swimming pool all day long and burn calories? Actually, there's some data that says if you and I sit in a pool that's cold enough and we shiver all day long, you know, you're sitting here like this all day long, believe it or not, you actually burn some calories. And shivering, of course, is muscular activity. But most of the time, if you and I are sitting, we are not burning very many calories. And so you say, wow, I've got to do something that's sort of daily and routine. I've got to do something that doesn't hurt me. I've got to do something that isn't too hard. And I've got to do something that burns lots of calories. What the heck is that? Well, let's look at the two general kinds of activities that people do. I'm kind of running out of room here, but I'll squeeze it into this corner and box it off. Now, there are two general kinds of activities. And these really include kinds where you bear weight, weight-bearing activities, and obviously things that are not weight-bearing. Things that are weight-bearing and things that are not weight-bearing. And there's actually a third category that I kind of say is sort of kind of weight-bearing. Now let's think what those things are, realizing that I want you to keep these four criteria in mind as you pick something that's going to help you both lose body fat and keep body fat off over the years. Weight-bearing things. Obviously, the ultimate weight-bearing thing is moving our bodies around. It is walking, it is moving from place to place. Those are things where we carry our body around, and they burn quite a few calories per minute or per mile. Non-weight-bearing things are things like riding exercise bicycles, or rowing, or some kind of machinery where you sit and do an activity. Those are non-weight-bearing. In general, they don't burn quite as many calories as the weight-bearing things. Now think of the things that are sort of kind of weight-bearing. The two that I put in that category, and our fitness people talk about all the time, are things like swimming, where you are using your whole body, but some of the body is being supported by the water. And it's a very good activity, swimming, and yet some data says that swimmers don't lose quite as many calories per minute or per hour as some of the tables say. And I think, again, it's because they're not really supporting their body. The water is doing some of the work. The other one, of course, is if you're riding a bicycle, you really are doing, and you're riding a bicycle out on the road, not an exercise bike, you are weight bearing in essence. It takes more calories for a 300-pound man to ride a bicycle down the road than it does for a 300-pound man to ride an exercise bike in a studio. In other words, he's weight bearing when he's when he's out on the road, and he's not weight bearing when he's in a studio. So you should see that there are three different kinds and categories of exercise. The ultimate exercise, I guess, would be one where one uses his upper body a little bit and uses muscles all over his body. I'll get into the reasons for that in just a second. Now, if one looks carefully at those things, he would have to say, well, I don't know if I know of any kinds of activities that really meet all of these criteria and are part of this. And I guess what I decided a few years ago that the greatest activity that I could do that met all of those criteria was walking. And you'll hear all of us talking about walking here at Health by Design, because we know that walking is something you've got to do for the rest of your life. As I always say to people, you know, you pick something you got to do till you're 95, you have to walk to the John when you're 95. And if that's really true, then you ought to just as well pick walking as an activity for maintenance of life quality and maintenance of a leaner body. If you think about it, walking can be done daily. It's cheap. It's almost always weather dependent, of course. You could go out at different times of the day. You may be able to walk on a treadmill in your house. Those are things that are good about walking. Usually walking doesn't injure people, even people who have degenerative arthritis in their knees. I had a lady recently who was 75 years old who couldn't walk 50 feet when she came to Health by Design. And after a month or so of losing body fat and walking every day, she was walking 2 miles on a treadmill. And clearly, walking is relatively non-injurious unless you already have a cartilage injury or arthritis. Walking really isn't very hard. Of all the things we do it from the time we're little kids until the time we're old, and it really isn't a very hard activity. Of course, it's hard for you when your body fat is relatively high, but it gets to be easier and easier as we do it. And finally, walking, relatively speaking, burns a lot of calories. If you think what especially for people who are heavy, when you're moving your body from point A to point B, you are using, relatively speaking, a lot of calories. And on your sheet, I know it shows you what walking it is and what rowing is and what cross-country skiing is and all these various kinds of activity. I'd like you to learn walking because I think walking is so easy for us. Basically, the way to look at calories in walking is one of two ways we do it. Number one, we say that for each 150 pounds of body weight, we burn 100 calories per mile of walking. That's another way of saying that you can take your weight times about 2/3, 0.66, or 2/3, and calculate calories per mile expended. Weight times 2/3 gives calories per mile. So typically for me, a guy who weighs close to 200 pounds, I know that I burn 2/3 times 200, or somewhere in the neighborhood, 2/3 times my 200 pounds, which gives me 140 or so calories per mile used for walking. And I can use that day after day after day, mile after mile after mile in my energy balance equations. Now, we'll get into some other points about walking with hand weights and things like that in a little while, but I think this one you ought to know, and every time I ask you about it, you ought to be able to say, gee, for every 150 pounds of my body weight, I burn 100 calories per mile. Now, as we get into foods, the first thing you'd say is, gee, you know, I only burn, I can walk about 3 miles in an hour. That gives me 3 times 2/3 times my weight, which is about 400 calories for walking for a whole hour. 400 calories, and Player said that I burn that 1 pound of fat is 3,500 calories. You mean to me that I have to walk 4 miles for 9 days to burn 1 pound of fat? That really isn't worth it. And I don't blame you for saying that if you're talking about walking for 9 days and that's the end of your program. But I want you to put the math to walking for a year. If you're, let's say, a 200-pound person and you burn 130 calories a mile, and you make it a part of your life to walk 1 mile every day. 1 mile every day is 130 calories a mile for a 200-pound person. Let's go ahead and do some of the math here. 130 calories per mile per day for a 1 mile walk, and that's at 365 days per year. And that comes out to somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 or 40,000 calories. I won't do the multiplication, but about 40,000 total calories per year. And when you divide that by 3,500 calories per pound, we find out that walking 130 calories per day, just moving your body 1 mile per day, gives you about 13.5 to 14 pounds of fat lost per year. 13 or 14 pounds of fat loss per year. And that's this year and next year and the next year and the next year. And you can see that although you seem to get very little walking for a mile, it's like eating a big apple. That's all you burn in calories. But when you do it day after day after day for a year, it's 13 or 14 pounds per mile. And then you double that for 2 miles and triple it for 3 miles. You can see how many of you, without even changing EI here, not messing around with your diet at all, can see a substantial amount of fat loss just from developing a daily routine activity that doesn't hurt you, that isn't too hard, and relatively speaking, burns lots of calories. So I think walking is, relatively speaking, a wonderful activity. Now, every once in a while you'll see people out walking and they'll be carrying hand weights or that sort of thing. And you say, why the heck would somebody carry hand weights when they walk? And there are 2 reasons for that, and I don't want to go into it too deeply. Let me erase my 4 categories here. I don't want to go into it too deeply, but I want to explain why somebody would lift weights or walk with hand weights, because it's very, very important that you know that you don't have to do that, but it's kind of neat if you do. The first reason is that your resting metabolic rate is a function of your, what we call your lean mass, back in lecture 1. Resting metabolic rate, which is measured in calories per 24 hours, is a function of lean mass. In other words, the more lean mass you have, the more calories you burn per day. So if you had a way of increasing lean mass, then you could also have a way of raising your motor speed, raising your resting metabolic rate, which is 70% of everything you burn. So if you could put even, let's say that you could go from here to here by doing some weight training or walking with weights or doing something that works your upper body, you could then take your lean mass up a pound or 2. You could take your calories burned, maybe a couple or 3 calories an hour upward from here to here, and the net result would be a much bigger resting metabolic rate. And you say, gee, if I went up only 4 calories an hour on my resting metabolic rate, that doesn't sound like much. Well, 4 calories per hour times 24 hours a day is 96 calories a day. 100 calories a day times 365 days is 36,500 calories in a year. Divide that by 3,500 and you find out that by raising your resting metabolic rate by only 4 calories per hour, you could have lost about 11 pounds of body fat in a year without ever messing with your diet again. So some people are now doing a lot of work looking at even taking middle-aged women and older women and sedentary men and putting them in training programs where they begin to do some weights. Maybe not very much, maybe 5 minutes, 3 days a week is all, doing a bench press or doing wings or doing some kind of activity that strengthens your upper body. And if you do that, you have a chance to be harder and better toned. I have 2 ladies right now who are in their 70s and are actually lifting weights and rowing and doing things for their upper body and feeling wonderful about it. And the reason they feel so good is that they're using muscles that they haven't used for many years, and relatively speaking, they're probably increasing their resting metabolic rate. We can't calculate that or prove that. Well, we can on the metabolic cart. We could actually measure that metabolic rate rises when lean mass goes up. So that's one of the reasons one would carry weights when he walks or work out with weights. The other reason is a little bit more complex, and Cheryl and others will get into this with you in detail when you go down to the Fitness Institute for your walk and your introduction to equipment in 2 weeks. But that other concept is something called the target heart rate. And the target heart rate goes like this, that individuals in metabolic centers and fitness facilities have shown that for you to improve cardiovascularly, to improve your cardiac output, to improve your lung volumes, to improve your fitness, if you will, you need to have your pulse in a certain range relative to your maximal pulse. It's been shown years ago that for men and women, you could estimate the maximal rate that your heart will go by subtracting your age from 220. When you and I were born, we could get about 220 maximal beats per minute out of our heart. And with each passing year after that, our maximal heart rate drops down by 1 beat, give or take a few. So you could say if you're a 40-year-old man, like I am, kind of, you would be able to get your heart rate to about 180 beats per minute. Now, what Dr. Cooper and others have shown is that if your heart rate is between 60 and 85% of that number, that you will show steady improvement in your fitness over time. You will be able to walk faster and farther and have better energy and so forth. Now, you say, well, what is that? Well, you can do the multiplication, but it's somewhere for a 40-year-old man I know between 118 and 150 beats per minute, somewhere in that range, 60 to 85%. And as long as I am walking with my pulse in that range, I find that I'm in an aerobic training zone and I get better and better and better in my fitness. A few years ago when I stopped running and began walking, I learned some fascinating things. I went out for a walk the first night, tried to walk 3 miles instead of running 3 miles, and I was just bored silly because my pulse rate only got up to about 90. And so I said, gee, this walking stuff isn't too good. And when I tried to pick my speed up, walking wasn't very comfortable, and I really thought I was going to injure myself by walking really, really fast, race walking. So I said, I wonder if there's some other way that I can get my pulse up into this zone. Well, the thing that I decided to try, I was lifting a heavy box in the garage and my pulse went up to 130 or 40, and I said, I wonder if I could carry some weights. And I got into reading books about hand weights and things like that. And lo and behold, I went out the first night to carry 3-pound weights. And I got about a half mile down the road and my arms were so tired and my pulse was so fast that I put the weights under a bush and went the rest of the way without the weights. But over time, I learned to carry those weights for 3 miles. And my pulse, which was originally 150, gradually came on down to about 120. And I learned that I was getting more and more fit carrying those weights and walking long distances. And so I moved on up to 5-pound weights. And that was fascinating. The first night that I carried the 5-pound weights, I thought I was going to die. Because again, my pulse went back up to 150, and I was carrying them along. It's one of the techniques you can get to sort of carry along your weights as you go. And my pulse was 150 and I was feeling terrible. But you know, after about 4 or 5 months of carrying 5-pound weights, lo and behold, my pulse came back down to 115 or 120. What I was doing, of course, was becoming aerobically trained. My heart was getting better, my lungs were getting better, and of course I was getting all the benefits of calories burned and of decreasing body fat content and increasing lean mass. At the same time, my shoulders, my arms, my back, and my chest were getting bigger and stronger, and I was feeling much better about myself. So in essence, when you, we'll get more into this stuff about pulse rate and training heart ranges and things like that, but I wanted you to have a little bit of a concept of what a resting heart rate or what the target heart rate is for people to achieve maximal fitness. So when you see somebody walking down the road carrying hand weights, or you think of somebody in a gym lifting weights, why would they do that sort of thing? Why would one want to lift weights to lose body fat? It isn't that you would add it to your exercise. It isn't up here. I don't even put my weightlifting into EECs. EECs, extra exercise calories for me, is walking 3 miles, 390 calories a day. Every day I do my factor times weight plus 390. And if I happen to go 5 miles, it's 5 times 130. That's 650 extra calories. Occasionally I can walk 5 miles on weekends. And that's my factor times weight plus EEC. But when I lift weights, unless I do it for an hour where I know I expended an extra 300 or 400 calories, I don't even put it in my records, but I know that I'm doing it to increase my resting metabolic rate because I'm increasing lean mass, as I showed before. And when I walk with weights, I'm doing it both to stay aerobic and improve my cardiovascular fitness, and I'm also doing it to increase my resting metabolic rate and my lean mass, which are marvelous when I'm trying to lose body fat. So I think in summary, that people who go on diets need to have increased physical activity programs, not to lose more calories, but first of all, to maintain a better resting metabolic rate while they're doing their diet, and number 2, to maintain a better lean mass. In other words, not lose the muscle and the bone, but lose fatness. Those are the first 2 reasons. The third thing, of course, is that the reason one does an extra exercise experience is to change his lifestyle in here, to give him a chance to live with this metabolic defect, if you will, to give him a chance to play on the same field with these guys who really don't have to think about any of this stuff. And to the extent that you incorporate some kind of activity that you don't do into your life, it will get easier and easier to live with this metabolic rate at a weight that's much more acceptable to you when you came in here. Again, our goals are health, our goals are living life at a different composition than we did when we got here. As I said, those of us who have relatively bad metabolic rates have to be smarter. We have to be educated, we have to be accountable, and we have to have tools to use. I hope that this gives you a good introduction to fitness and activity. Thank you very much.